Coming Home. Written by Ink in My Heart and on the Page. And read by Eleanor Elizabeth. Chapter 2. Part 2. Tony tried desperately not to have a panic attack in the back seat of the car as Happy drove them to the FBI. It was hard to find a steady breathing pattern when Pepper looked as if she was on the verge of an attack herself. He swallowed down the tightness in his chest and mentally ran through his techniques to calm himself down. After 11 years, they had finally found their son. Losing Peter had nearly broken them. Tony threw himself into turning Stark Industries around, no longer creating weapons, and he threw himself into becoming Iron Man. He nearly lost Pepper in the process, the strain it put on their marriage nearly tearing them apart, and for a while it did. As the Avengers were formed, Tony fought hard to get Pepper back. He couldn't lose the two biggest loves of his life. Their marriage had gotten back on track, and they were now stronger than ever. The only thing that was missing was their son. And now he was back. He reached across the seat, taking Pepper's shaking hand in his. Pepper looked at him, eyes still wet and her face pale. Her breathing was shaky, her whole body trembling. She squeezed Tony's hand tightly, giving him a weak smile. "Almost here," Happy said quietly from the front seat. Pepper inhaled shakily, and Tony was sure that he was about to have a heart attack. Neither spoke as Happy pulled up to the FBI. They climbed out of the car, immediately putting on a blank face in case any press was lingering around. Neither Tony nor Pepper had wanted Peter growing up under the camera flashes of the paparazzi, and had striven to keep him away from all of it. Of course, it didn't stop the world from knowing that they had a child, or that he had gone missing. As soon as they entered the building, Happy right behind them, Agent Williamson was there to greet them. "Mr. and Mrs. Stark, thank you for coming." Williamson nodded. "I know you must be anxious, so follow me." Agent Williamson had been the fourth agent assigned to their case, and Tony liked him the best. He hated the first agent on principle. He had never believed that they were doing enough to find Peter. Agents number 2 and 3 hadn't been any better. Agent Williamson didn't pander to him or Pepper, giving them any false hope. He had said that he would do what he could, but they had to come to terms that they may never find their son. On the darkest days, they often wondered if their son was dead, if Obadiah had done the unimaginable and killed their child. But neither Happy nor Rhodey had let either of them think that for long. Williamson led them through the FBI, taking them to a conference room. When they entered, the glass walls went white for privacy as Williamson shut the door. "Agent Williamson, please, is it our son?" Pepper asked, foregoing any pleasantries. "We ran a blood sample against yours and Tony's." Williamson gestured for them to take a seat. When they were all seated, he allowed a small smile to lift his lips. "We got the results earlier this morning. It was a match. We have found your son." Tony felt his heart stop for a beat, before Pepper was bursting into tears, tucking herself into his neck. He exhaled shakily, wrapping his arms around her as he felt hot tears of relief roll down his neck. He closed his eyes, dropped a kiss onto his wife's hair. He felt Happy's heavy hand squeeze his shoulder tightly, and he finally felt his heart start to beat again. They stayed like that as they attempted to compose themselves, gathering their thoughts before Pepper pulled herself together, wiping her eyes. "Is he okay?" Pepper asked, the tears still evident in her voice. "Physically, Peter's fine," Williamson assured them. "Where has he been?" Tony asked, feeling as though the breath was knocked out of him. "He's been living in Queens," Williamson said. "Queens?" Pepper gasped. She stared at Tony. He had been so close to them this whole time, and neither of them had known. Tony squeezed his wife's hand before turning back to Agent Williamson. "Who has he been living with?" "A woman called May Parker," Williamson said. Tony searched his memory for any reference to the name Parker, but he came up with nothing. "Who is she? How did she get Peter?" "May Parker is a nurse," Williamson explained. "Peter has been living with her since he was 6 years old." "6?" Pepper repeated. "He was taken when he was 3. Where was he during those years?" Williamson nodded. "This is where it gets complicated." "Complicated how?" Tony frowned. a hard edge seeping into his tone. "We are still trying to uncover all the details as to how Peter was kidnapped from your Malibu home," Williamson said. "What we do know is that Peter was taken in by Richard and Mary Parker." Pepper shook her head. "I don't understand. Who are they?" "Richard and Mary Parker were scientists, most likely working on genetic engineering," Williamson said. "Most of their work has been classified or is off the books." Tony gritted his teeth. He knew what off the books meant. It was research that wasn't exactly ethical and was mostly funded by people who had no care in the world for what they created. People like Obadiah. "Please tell me you have them in custody," Tony growled. "There is no need," Williamson said. "They died when Peter was 6. They were in a plane crash headed on a business trip." "Oh, God, please tell me Peter wasn't with them," Pepper groaned. "No, he was staying in the care of who he thought to be his aunt and uncle," Williamson said. "Ben Parker was the brother of Richard Parker. They often babysat Peter when Richard and Mary were on business trips. They took full custody of Peter when they passed." Tony swallowed hard, willing his hands to stop shaking. "Have they been good to him?" "They have provided Peter with everything he has needed," Williamson assured them. "They live in an apartment in Queens, a somewhat rough neighborhood, but relatively safe. Peter goes to a great school, Midtown School of Science and Technology. Peter earned a full scholarship to attend." Pepper let out a wet laugh. "Of course, he's brilliant, just like his dad." "Of course he is," Tony quipped breathlessly. He let out a strangled-sounding noise, and Happy squeezed his shoulder again tightly. "Wait, you said he was living with May? Yet you mentioned a man, Ben." "Ben Parker was shot and killed in a mugging incident 6 months ago," Williamson said gravely. "Peter was there and witnessed the whole thing." "No," Pepper whispered, horrified. Tony breathed sharply through his nose. How much did his kid have to take? "Was he hurt?" "No," Williamson said. "There wasn't a scratch on him." Tony nodded, relieved, but his hand still twitched sporadically with a tremor. "It is unclear to us if Ben Parker knew that Peter had been kidnapped," Williamson said, "but we have determined that May Parker had no idea she was raising a kidnapped child." "She didn't know?" Tony growled. "How could she not know?" "Like I said, it's complicated," Williamson said. "After questioning her last night, we believe that she had no idea that Peter was a kidnapped child. She is genuinely horrified about the whole thing. You should know that she insisted you be contacted immediately." "Can we see Peter?" Pepper asked. "I want to see our son." "Of course." Williamson stood to his feet. "Does he know?" Tony asked. "He was informed last night," Williamson said. "He's taken it rather well considering. He stayed here last night under our care. We deemed May Parker a non-threat, and he was adamant that she stayed with him. You should know that she has been helping him come to terms with this." Pepper nodded, squeezing Tony's hand. "Thank you. I'll go get your son. I won't be long." Williamson gave them a small smile before he turned and left the room. Tony sunk into the chair, hand resting over his heart that was beating too hard in his chest. "We found our Peter." "We're getting back our boy," Pepper smiled tearfully. Peter didn't sleep. Though the FBI had provided him with a pillow, blanket, and couch to sleep on, he just couldn't get his mind to switch off. Eventually, Agent Williamson had stopped asking him questions and instead took some of his blood. After that, he left the room, only to return with his Aunt May. Only, she's not really my aunt, Peter thought. May had pulled him into a tight hug, kissing the top of his head. She pulled back, keeping her hands on his shoulders, and looked him directly in the eye. "I am so sorry, Peter. I had no idea. I'm so sorry," May had apologized. "May," Peter whimpered. "They said I was kidnapped." "Listen to me," May said, soothing back his curls. "This is big, and this is scary. I'm scared too. But no matter what happens, I love you." "I love you too," Peter sniffed wetly. "Peter, you know I would never willingly kidnap a child, right?" May asked. "What? No, of course you wouldn't," Peter cried. "You didn't kidnap me. You raised me. You've done everything for me, even when you didn't have to." "I love you, Peter. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." May smiled. "But you're also the best thing that ever happened to your real parents. If I'd known, Peter, I promise I would have helped you get home to them." Peter nodded. I know you would have. I know you would never hurt me." May kissed his forehead, pulling him into another hug. "We will get through this." At some point, May had fallen into a fitful sleep, but Peter hadn't been able to join her. How could he, when he just learned that he wasn't really Peter Parker? He ran his hands through his hair before he rubbed his eyes tiredly. He tried desperately to remember something of the people who claimed to be his parents. Apart from the occasional experiment, he couldn't remember that much of them. All his good memories had been with May and Ben. He sighed, slumping against the pillow. He had never felt unloved by May or Ben. May had never been one to lie to him, and he believed her when she said that she had no idea. She looked physically sick at the idea that she'd been keeping him from his real parents. Parents. He had parents. They hadn't told him who they were, and he hadn't asked. But now he was curious. What were they like? Was his mum a terrible cook like May? Or as strong and fierce as her? Did his dad work with his hands like Ben had? Did he laugh loudly like he had? Would they love him? "Did you get any sleep?" May's voice startled Peter, and he sat up. "Oh, yeah, a little." "Liar," May snorted, swinging her legs over the end of the couch. "How are you doing this morning?" Peter shrugged. "I don't know." "That's okay," May said. She smoothed her hair back before leaning over and grabbing her glasses, sliding them back into place. "Do you have any questions this morning?" "A million," Peter admitted. "Me too," May sighed. "What's your most pressing question?" "Will they like me?" Peter asked, his voice small. "Oh, sweetie." May stood and crossed the room until she was sinking into the couch beside him. "Your parents have been looking for you for 11 years. Of course they will like you. Besides, you're kind of impossible not to like." Peter snorted. "I think some of the kids at school did not get that memo." May bumped his shoulder with hers. "I want you to give this a chance. I know everything has changed completely in a very short amount of time, but I want you to give this a chance." "Okay." Peter nodded before he leaned down and rested his head on May's shoulder. If Peter could get through being bitten by a radioactive spider and becoming a superhero, he could get through meeting his real parents. They stayed that way until an agent came back in with a tray of fruit, bagels, and coffee. Peter picked at a bagel while May drank the coffee, neither of them particularly wanting it, but it was better than going in on an empty stomach. Peter eventually pulled out his phone and saw a few new notifications were waiting for him. There was a text from Ned, which he would deal with later, because right now he wasn't sure how to put anything into words. The rest were from Instagram. While Peter scrolled through his feed, May stepped off to the side to call the school and said he wouldn't be in for the rest of the week. May had just finished up the call when Agent Williamson stepped back into the room. "Good morning," he greeted them. "I hope you were comfortable here last night." "Thank you," May said, "and thank you for the breakfast." Williamson nodded. "You're welcome." "What happens now?" Peter asked, looking between May and the agent. "What happens now is that I'm going to take you to a conference room," Williamson smiled, "and reintroduce you to your parents." "They're here?" Peter swayed on his feet. He felt May's hand squeeze his shoulder tightly. Williamson nodded. "And they are very excited to see you." "Oh." Peter blinked. He looked down at his hands, focusing on the steady beat of May's heart. "They are?" Williamson chuckled. "Yes, Peter. I've been working with your parents for the past 5 years looking for you. They have never once stopped looking for you." Something warm twisted in Peter's stomach, and his breath stuttered out. "If you are ready, would you like to go meet them?" Williamson asked. Peter looked at May, who squeezed his shoulder and gave him an encouraging smile. "You can do this, Peter." May said. "You'll be with me?" Peter asked in a small voice. "Of course, sweetie," May said. "I would like to apologize to them in person, if they'll let me." Taking a deep breath, Peter turned back to Williamson and nodded. "Lead the way." "All right, follow me," Williamson said, and he led them out of the room and down a well-lit corridor. Peter was glad for the steady hand that May kept on his shoulder as they followed the agent. Nerves twisted tightly in his stomach, and he felt his hand shaking. His eyes darted around, taking in everything in sight. He stretched his hearing, trying to catch a glimpse of his parents speaking, but he wasn't sure what they sounded like, so all he heard was the office workers around them. Williamson passed several doors before he came to a stop at a set of whited-out glass walls. "Here we are, Peter." Williamson paused with his hand on the handle of the door. "Are you ready?" "I guess," Peter whispered. "I'll be right with you," May assured him. Licking his lips, Peter nodded. "I'm ready." "Here we go." Williamson smiled, and he pushed open the door. Peter hesitated as the agent disappeared into the room, not quite able to make his legs move. "Mr. and Mrs. Stark," Peter heard Williamson say. "This is Peter." May squeezed his shoulder once more before giving him a firm push towards the door. He held his breath as he passed through, eyes immediately darting to the other end of the room. He came to an abrupt halt, blinking dumbly at his parents. He felt May crash into him at his abrupt stop, but he didn't budge. "Oh, Peter!" May huffed, steadying herself. "Are you?" "Oh." Pepper Stark, formerly known as Pepper Potts, current CEO of Stark Industries, was staring at Peter with tear-filled eyes and a wobbly smile on her face. She took a few unsteady steps towards him, eyes roaming over his features. "Peter?" she breathed. Hi, I'm Pepper Stark," Peter blurted out. The overwhelming nerves of meeting his parents for the first time was superseded by his inner gawking fanboy, and he had no control in what was coming out of his mouth. Holy crap! You're Pepper Stark! You're CEO of Stark Industries and are in the top 100 most influential women in the country!" There was a snort, and Peter's eye snapped to the larger man at the back, who he recognized as Happy Hogan. But he was quickly forgotten as Peter locked eyes with Tony Stark. He felt his jaw drop, and suddenly his mouth was moving again. "Tony Stark!" Peter all but whimpered. "You're Tony Stark." "Sure am, kid." Tony grinned, his eyes looking wet. "Oh my god, Mr. Stark, your thesis on nanotechnology and how we can implement it into everyday life, such as medical structures, was groundbreaking," Peter gushed. Tony blinked at him, looking taken aback. "You read that? You understood it?" Peter nodded, his brain finally catching up with the situation, and his cheeks flushed. Yes, I'm sorry." Tony shook his head. "Don't be sorry." His voice came out hoarse. There was an awkward silence, and nobody seemed quite sure what to do next. "Why don't we sit down?" Happy suggested. "Good idea," May said. Steered towards a seat on the opposite side of the table, Peter sat down. He noticed as everyone took their seats that Agent Williamson was hovering by the door, silently watching them all. "Peter?" Pepper caught his attention. She smiled at him, full of warmth that had Peter relaxing in his chair. "I know this is a lot to take in right now, but you cannot believe how relieved we are to see you. We missed you so much." "It's nice to meet you," Peter smiled hesitantly. "I'm sorry for not, being there." Pepper shook her head roughly while Tony said, "You don't have anything to be sorry about." Peter nodded and turned to look at his aunt. "This is May. She's taken really good care of me." May smiled at him before she turned to face his parents. "It's nice to meet both of you. I am so sorry. I promise you that I had no idea about Peter. If I did, I would have brought him home sooner." "Thank you," Tony said gruffly. "She didn't know," Peter defended firmly. "May would never do anything like that. She's been really good to me." There was silence before Pepper took a deep breath and nodded at May. "Thank you for taking care of Peter." "It's been a pleasure." May smiled at Peter. "You have an amazing son, and I am truly and deeply sorry that you've missed him for so long." Peter shifted in his chair, chewing on his bottom lip. "Peter?" Pepper asked softly. "Do you know why?" Peter blurted out, looking between Tony and Pepper. "Why what?" Tony asked gently, shifting forward in his chair. He looked different than Peter had seen him on TV. He always looked so effortlessly cool and collected. As Iron Man, he seemed untouchable and like steel. But sitting in front of him right now, he looked softer and more emotional than Peter imagined anyone was allowed to see. "Why I was taken from you?" Peter clarified. Pepper and Tony shared a look before Tony cleared his throat. "That's my fault." "Tony," Pepper said sharply, fixing him with a glare. "It wasn't your fault." Tony sighed heavily and ran a hand over his face. "How much do you know about me and Iron Man?" "I think everybody knows you're Iron Man," Peter said honestly. He smiled when he got a small chuckle out of Tony. "Yeah, I really didn't stick to the cue cards on that one," Tony winked. "Long story short, Obadiah Stane took you to hurt us." The name was briefly familiar. Like all the kids his age, he'd grown up with superheroes as the norm. But the name meant nothing to Peter. He made a mental note to ask Ned to look up the name once he told him everything that was going on. Ned. How was Peter supposed to tell Ned that his parents were Pepper and Tony Stark? "Will he come after Peter again?" May asked. "No," Tony said darkly. "He'll never be able to hurt Peter again." Peter shivered at the implication and wisely decided to shift away from that conversation. "How did I end up with my the other people?" "It's still unclear," Pepper said. "I have several theories on that," Tony muttered, and Pepper elbowed him, causing him to grunt. "I would like to help in any way I can," May offered. "Thank you," Pepper nodded, offering May a small smile. "We appreciate that." Mrs. Stark? Pepper?" Peter stumbled over her title, not quite able to bring himself to call her mum just yet. "Yes, Peter?" Pepper smiled at him, ignoring his awkward attempt to call her by her name. Peter chewed his lip, hesitating for a moment. "Do you have a picture of me? As a baby, I mean." Pepper's smile widened, and from the ground she brought up her purse. She slipped her hand inside, and when she withdrew it, there was a photograph in her hand. Still beaming, she slid it across the table to Peter. Trembling slightly, Peter picked up the photograph and blinked at the picture. He sucked in a breath as his eyes drank in the picture. In the photo, Pepper held a small boy in her arms, beaming down at the small bundle. Tony, who looked younger, had his arm wrapped around her, grinning brightly down at the baby. Down at Peter. He had never seen himself as a baby. He'd asked May, of course, but she said that they never had any baby pictures of him. He found it odd, but not suspicious at the time. Thought that they had been lost along with his so-called parents. But it became suddenly so real as to why there were never any baby pictures of him. These were his parents, not Mary and Richard Parker, the people he could hardly remember. His parents, who were alive, who had been looking for him. "Look how cute you were!" May cooed by his side. "Yeah," Peter choked out. "This was the first time we took you home," Pepper sniffed. "You were so small," Tony chuckled, shaking his head. "God, I was terrified." Peter traced a finger over the picture. "You look so happy." "Of course we were," Tony huffed. "You were the best thing that ever happened to us. Happiest day of my life. Right up there with marrying you, Pep." Peter laughed, somewhat hysterically, and the next thing he knew, there were tears rolling down his cheeks, and he was trying to suppress his sobs. "I'm sorry," Peter hiccuped. I don't know why." "It's okay," May soothed, her hand rubbing at his back. "It's a lot." "Can I?" Pepper asked. Peter heard her stand as he desperately wiped at his eyes. He felt May move away, her hand leaving his back, before Pepper was taking her space, her hand gently running through his curls. I'm sorry, Peter cried, and then he was throwing himself into her arms. Pepper grabbed him tightly, hugging him close as he sobbed into her arms. It's okay, Pepper whispered in his ear, pressing a kiss to his curls. Oh, Peter, it's okay. He felt the chair on his side shift away, and then there was another, larger hand rubbing his back, and a distinct scent of motor oil and coffee surrounded him. It's okay, kid, Tony said. Peter sobbed, pulling away from Pepper to wrap his arms around Tony, hugging him tightly. He felt Tony wrapping his arms around him just as tightly. It's okay, Tony repeated in his ear. I've got you. I got you, Pete. Hey there, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. It's Eleanor, and I hope you're having a lovely day today. Surprise, it's a double upload because I missed you, okay? Not being able to make podfics was seriously driving me crazy, and I know some of you only listen to, like, the ones that are in the specific fandoms you're in. So if you weren't going to listen to the My Hero one, or you're not starting Mastermind because you want to wait until it's finished, which is fair, there you go. I am back after my terrible, terrible illness. I feel so good to, like, not be horrifyingly ill anymore. Though I'm not going to lie, the amount of times while recording this, I could hear my voice breaking because she's still a little testy. But for the most part, I think she's okay. Again, sorry if some of the voice acting was a little bit shit. I'm trying my best. I just am excited to be back. So, like, sorry, not sorry if it was bad. This chapter's so good. I was so emotional recording it because it's just so sweet. There was a lot of me that I had to cut out that was just like me starting a line and not making it to the end because I was like, oh, this is so cute. Oh, what the fuck? Peter meeting Tony and Pepper is the most adorable thing I've ever read. Just like, oh, beautiful. But let me know what you thought about it down in the comments below. Oh, what a fun time. You can also like the video, if you liked it, and to boost my serotonin levels. You can also go and subscribe to be notified whenever I make new videos. You can also, now, as of me coming back, support me on Ko-Fi. Fun times. There is no not awkward way to say that. I don't know. It's kind of embarrassing. I don't know. It just feels awkward. I don't know. Maybe I'll get used to it. You can also join the Discord because it's a fun time. And hang out with us all over there. Actually, if you do support me on Ko-Fi, you do get a Discord role, and it's fun. Maybe that's not that fun. I thought it was cool. I also, upcoming, will be having another Q&A coming up / surprise video. Something's happening. I'm gonna do a thing. But for that, please send questions. It'll be a fun time. If you care to get to know me. I also have, other videos that are up right now, if this is your first one. I have lots of other fics. Listen to them. I'm really proud of some of them. But otherwise, until I see you again, be sure to practice some self-care. Go to bed on time so that you can get a good amount of sleep. Be sure to remember to brush your teeth. You gotta do it at least twice a day. Be sure to eat your 5 a day. I want you to be eating up on them fruit and veg. And definitely do not forget to hydrate, okay? I've been so hydrated while I've been off sick because that's what the doctor told me to do. They told me to hydrate so much. And I've been hydrating like you would not believe. And if I can do it, you can do it, okay? Love yourself. Take care of yourself. Yes, this is a threat. I will catch you guys laters.